Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. It's a thrill to be here. I love sitting next to heroes, and Stephen is a hero of mine. As John has said, and as I'm sure most of you know, he is one of the leading public intellectuals. There are other phrases one can use, but I hope you accept that one. In the English-speaking world, I first encountered him as a linguist, as a man who explained and seemed to be Noam Chomsky's physical manifestation on Earth in terms of his explanation of some of Chomsky and generative grammar and all those things, the language instinct, words and rules, wonderful books like that. And then, of course, the blank slate. And one sensed a move then from Stephen, who is a genius in all kinds of areas of thought, cognition, evolutionary psychiatry, and all kinds of areas of neuroscience and language, which are fascinating. But the move from writing about language to writing about the blank slate, which, while obviously connected to the human mind, one sensed to move towards something a little more political, something a little more addressing what I think you have seen as a fault in public discourse about the mind and about society and about culture and about intellectuals. And that was picked up with the wonderful Better Angels of Our Nature, which shocked people with its optimism. Stephen is now considered a new optimist. And this wonderful book, Enlightenment Now, a great title and one which I'm sure we can all think, yes, finally someone has come up and spoken for enlightenment, continues this journey. And so I wanted to say, Stephen, everything you do, I admire, except your spelling of the name Stephen. But we'll overlook that. Okay. And if I can ask you, if it has been a conscious or you felt impelled to move from the more academic sphere of linguistics, psycholinguistics, and neuroscience into the cultural sphere?
I made the crossover when people would ask what I did for a living, and I would say, well, I study language, how it develops in children, how it works. People say, wow, that's really interesting. And I thought there is a market for bringing ideas about language and mind to a broader understanding. And there had been a breakthroughs in public communication of science in areas like evolution, in cosmology, in dinosaurs, but no one that I knew of had tried to bring the discoveries of cognitive science to a broader public. And I thought, well, it would be fun to try. So I wrote The Language Instinct, which tried to explain everything you always wanted to know about language in what I hope would be an accessible format. And I guess it was an accessible format because people responded to it, and one thing led to another.
Right. And then this moved from that to the more, if I can say so, political side of it. I mean, you might have been looked at as a typical Harvard intellectual academic with sort of left-leaning principles, a liberal in the loose sense of the word. But of course, in the last few years, it's as if everything has changed in terms of our sense of what left or right means. And you have infuriated both left and right to some extent with both the blank slate and then the Better Angels of Our Nature. I wonder if you could tell me about your journey in that regard. If you think you've stayed the same but the world has changed, or you have altered your view of politics and
well, from the position inspired in part by Noam Chomsky that language is a human faculty, it's one of our innate capabilities, I extended to the question of what are our other innate faculties, and in How the Mind Works, I suggested that together with language, we have a suite of emotions: fear, jealousy, love, anger, gratitude. We have a set of ways of construing the world, a kind of intuitive physics, and intuitive biology, and intuitive psychology. We have aesthetic reactions to the world, a sense of which landscapes are beautiful versus threatening, which faces are attractive or not, and that this suite of psychological reactions could be explained in large part by evolution, the forces that give rise to innate mechanisms. But positing a complex human nature, at least for a lot of the 20th century, and beforehand, had a kind of more of a right-wing aroma than a left-wing aroma. Despite Chomsky himself, who was, of course, a rather flagrant leftist, as Mitt Romney might say, severe leftist. He called himself a severe conservative. So Chomsky did violate that equation, but there had been a kind of, in traditional liberalism, a kind of utopian vision that was based on the assumption that human nature was infinitely malleable, so that we were not saddled with fatal flaws. We did not have to accommodate human jealousy or dominance, desire for revenge, differences between the sexes, but with the proper socialization and child rearing, we could engineer society to in turn engineer humans.
Yes, I mean, in a way, it comes down to the very simple nature-nurture debate, that you were pushing it more towards nature. There was evolution, we were programmed, encoded with certain faculties and ways of perceiving the world and responding to it, as opposed to those being acculturated and the gift of a society in which we were born. Is that? I mean,
in a sense, although, in a sense, yes, and although what evolution programmed into us was a set of mechanisms, all of which could learn, because it would be a stupid organism indeed that did not respond to information about the environment, including other people. Yeah. But, and what I explored further in the blank slate was the political and moral and emotional colorings of the nature-nurture debate. Why the nature-nurture debate is not just a scientific debate, but also a political one. Yes. And it's because traditionally there was at least a strand of left liberalism that seemed to be committed to humans as blank slates, as infinitely malleable, whereas there is a strain of conservatism that began with the assumption that humans are tragically limited, that we are innately competitive and jealous, and also limited in our cognitive faculties, with implications such that we're not smart enough to design society from the top down, so we have to rely on distributed bottom-up systems like markets, that because humans are perennially tempted by conquest and exploitation, then we need deterrents like the rule of law and armed forces to deter invasions. So you had a kind of tragic vision which leaned a bit right, and you had a more utopian vision, depending on a blank slate, which leaned a bit left. I kind of explored those historical roots and then tried to scramble them by pointing out that it's really not a dichotomy, that if human nature is complex, if it has multiple parts, then there isn't you don't have to come down on the side that either humans are inherently selfish, tragically flawed, ultimately limited, or infinitely malleable plastic blank slates. That rather we have a set of motives, some of which have regrettable features, like our desire for revenge. On the other hand, we also there are parts of human nature that can channel and control and inhibit our darker impulses. We have a capacity for self-control in our massive frontal lobes. We can count to 10 and save for a rainy day and hold our horses and so on. Yes. We have cognitive faculties, such as the very ones that I explored in the books on language and the mind. We can create new ideas by combining old ideas in a combinatorial explosion of possibilities. We can have ideas about our ideas and ideas about our ideas about our ideas. Is that what you mean by combinatorial and recursive thinking? Indeed. So recursive that's a big thing of yours, isn't it? Indeed. Yeah. So a recursive representation is one that can contain an example of itself. Right. So every time you say, I think that he thinks that I'm coming, but I'm not, that is, you embed one thought within another thought, you're having a recursive thought. And that covers theory of mind and various other things. Yeah. So theory of mind is essentially depends on kind of a recursive mentalizing.
Being able to picture what other people might think.
Indeed. And then thanks to language, we also have the ability to learn from each other. And so as society tries out innovative arrangements, and some of them work better than others, we can share our ideas about which ones that work and which ones that don't. So there is scope for progress, for social improvement, given the toolbox that evolution gave us, the cognitive toolbox.
Right, so again, using your language idea, it may be true that language, the language instinct, competence, is encoded into us, but that doesn't mean we're all going to speak the same language.
Well, yes, indeed, that whatever nature gave us is a set of systems that are designed to be nurtured in the sense that even a capacity for language is not a capacity for English or for Japanese. It's a capacity to take in information from our fellow humans and allow us to speak and understand an infinite number of sentences going forward.
And I will share with you my terrible joke, which is that it's actually a mistake to think it's just nature and nurture. It's about human will and the passion to succeed, however brutally. So it's really nature, nurture, and Nietzsche. We'll come to Friedrich Nietzsche very soon because he's very much a bugaboo of yours.
Yes.
But if we now look at this extraordinary book, Enlightenment Now, most people have an idea of what maybe the Enlightenment is. We can think of printing giving rise to the Renaissance, giving rise to science and the Age of Reason, which then gives rise to what is known as the Enlightenment. And I'd love you just to sketch briefly, you can use your wonderful quotations from Kant, if you like, who himself defined Enlightenment, Aufklärung. I wondered if you could just explain what you see the Enlightenment as meaning.
I identify three themes as animating the Enlightenment, and they form most of the subtitle of the book. Reason, science, and humanism.
Progress.
And, well, which collectively lead to progress, indeed. Yeah. So reason comes from the realization that traditional sources of belief are actually generators of error. Things like authority, tradition, dogma, charisma, hermeneutic parsing of sacred texts, the subjective glow of certainty, and that there's no substitute for reason. And in fact, reason is, in a very real sense, not negotiable. Because
yes, but also even unreasonable ideologies use reason to justify themselves.
Indeed.
That's an important point, isn't it?
Indeed, that as soon as you even began to propose some alternative to reason and tried to persuade people why it was better than reason, you kind of lost the argument. Because as long as you're not threatening people, as long as you're not amassing an armed posse to convert people to your cause, as long as you're not bribing them, as long as you're giving them reasons, as long as you would insist, if challenged, that you're not full of crap, that people should take you seriously, then you've surrendered the point. You have.
It would be like saying there's no such thing as time, and I will tell you about it tomorrow. it just doesn't make sense. If you say this is why there is no reason, the word why is a reason word.
Precisely. That's exactly right.
And reason, as you say, is the absolute basis, the non-negotiable basis of the Enlightenment.
Exactly. Yeah. Then science comes from the conviction that the universe is intelligible, that we can formulate, we can try to explain things, and moreover, we can, since we can't a priori be certain of any of our explanations, we have an imperative to test them, to calibrate them against reality, and to reject the ones that the world tells us are false.
And that's what we call sometimes empiricism, for example. The testing of the validity and repetitive truth of an observation, for example.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And science, it's often said that science can't give us our values, that it can tell us about how the world does work, but not how it ought to work or how we ought to behave. And that is true as a matter of kind of a logical categorization. That is, a statement of fact and a statement of value are not the same thing. On the other hand, there are many insights of science that I argue must form part of the worldview, including the moral worldview of any educated person. such as naturalism, that the laws of the universe have no goal or purpose related to human well-being. That the laws of physics, they just don't care about you. They don't, if you get sick, there's no entity or agent that wanted you to get sick. Yes. If you fall off a cliff, there's no fate, it wasn't preordained, it's not fulfilling some mission or purpose. Stuff happens.
And I think if Victorians were as shocked as we think of them as being by Darwin, and actually there's some historical evidence that they weren't quite as shocked as we think they were, it wasn't by the fact that we may have descended from apes or be apes, it was that it presented a natural world which was so callous and unfeeling, and that we were the result of a simple, what we would now call algorithmic series of rules, not a design, and there was no purpose to our life except the shallow purpose of reproduction, as it were.
Well, indeed, there's no purpose judged by the laws of nature. Of course, once human brains come into existence, humans have purposes, but it's a mistake to project our purposes onto the laws of the cosmos. Yes. So that's an example of a scientific insight that has tremendous relevance for moral reasoning, including the fact that if we care about our well-being, we can't look to the cosmos to take care of us. That it's really up to us.
We can test empirically if prayers are answered, after all.
And the results are in.
Yeah. Yes. Thoughts and prayers, nil.
No, that's right. And even another scientific insight with enormous implications for the human condition is the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy.
Yes. Now, you spend a lot of time in this book talking about entropy, and I'd love you just to explain why this is more than just something that's important to physicists.
Yes. I mean, in the technical sense, the second law of thermodynamics is that entropy in a closed system increases, that is, disorder.
The heat goes from a hot body to a cold.
Differences in temperature, which are necessary to have usable energy, will inevitably dissipate over time unless the system is exposed to energy or information from the outside world, but that in closed systems, disorder increases. And one implication is that things going wrong don't need a special explanation in terms of any design or entity wanting things to go wrong. It's just the natural course of events for things not to go our way, simply because there are vastly more ways in which things can go wrong than for things to go right. And so we have to deploy energy and information in order to carve out a zone of beneficial order in our local environment with the use of energy.
And this was a recent discovery, because it's, we forgive our ancestors for noting, above all, examples of explosions of energy, volcanoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, mudslides. They would think it was a world in which energy could just appear from nowhere.
Yeah, that's true, misled by concentrated local sources of energy, yes, such as the Earth's core and the sun. And one implication of that is that we ask the wrong question when we ask, why is there poverty? Poverty is just the natural condition of the universe. The question that we should ask is, why is there wealth? And indeed, that was a major obsession of a number of Enlightenment thinkers, Adam
Most
Smith,
famously
and
Adam Smith,
and his Scottish and Dutch precursors. Yeah. But it does change the way you look at things if you realize that really what we ought to explain is why that we get to enjoy any order, prosperity, life-giving organization at all.
So we live in a world that, I think Tom Stoppard put it very well in Arcadia. Do you remember where the mathematician explains, if I take some rice pudding and it's got a lump of jam in the middle, and I take a teaspoon and revolve it 5 times, the rice pudding becomes pink. If I keep the teaspoon still and revolve it the other direction, I don't get the jam back. Yeah, right. You never get the jam back.
You don't get the jam back.
And that's the rule of the world, not getting the jam. So the world tends towards disorder, decay, as we know, sort of the heat death of the universe in the ultimate story. But and so life itself is pushing up, not just against gravity, but against, it has to find ways of efficiently using heat and calories, energy, work, they're all the same thing essentially, to erect a something that will fight the inevitable.
That's right. So the evolution is possible in local defiance of the law of entropy, not in defiance of it globally, because living things take in energy from the sun or from deep sea ocean vents. And use it to create zones of order. We do the same thing with our intelligence, where using information, we arrange matter into improbable configurations that suit our needs. So that's just part of the larger point that a scientific understanding doesn't just allow us to build gadgets, but it does speak to our ultimate predicament, our ultimate goal in life, which is to use information, that is knowledge, to carve out zones of beneficial order in this massive sea of increasing entropy. And then humanism is the third major theme, namely that what are we using this reason and science in service of? And the answer is broadly human flourishing, where human flourishing would include life, health, happiness, knowledge, culture, social warmth, and friendship, which sounds obvious. Who could be against human flourishing? Yeah. But it turns out that humanism is actually a rather exotic moral system, that there are alternatives, such as that the ultimate moral purpose is the glory of the nation or the tribe or the race, the predominance of the faith, bringing God's commandments to earth, carrying out some historical dialectic or messianic age being brought toward reality. So just concentrating the mind on what's good is to make people healthy and happy and knowledgeable and fulfilled. That's a distinct moral commitment, and that I identify as one of the contributions of the Enlightenment. Now, if you put them together, if we deploy knowledge to enhance human flourishing, and I should mention one other ingredient, which is a big theme of the Enlightenment, is that all of this is, humanism is possible because we're endowed by evolution, they didn't put it that way, but we put it that way now, with a sense of sympathy, with the ability to feel each other's pain, to have a concern with the well-being of others. Now, the sense of sympathy that evolution gave us is rather puny. It applies naturally to our genetic relatives, to our trading partners, our members of our clan, but it can be pushed outward by forces of cosmopolitanism, that is, by mixing of people and ideas, and by reason itself, that if you have to exchange ideas and values with other people, it's rather hard to maintain that my interests are special and yours aren't because I'm me and you're not. Now, I can say that, but I can't get you to take me seriously. And as soon as I have to negotiate agreements in larger circles of individuals, I'm forced to expand my circle of sympathy outward and to treat other people and ultimately other sentient creatures as equivalent in interests to my own.
So in a sense, the altruism that might have evolved in order for us to help our own specific kin group or tribe or clan or small group, an altruism that, as it were, allowed sacrifice for the greater good of a small group to which we belonged, can be applied to a much, much larger group.
That's right, and that's an idea. Darwin himself proposed this idea. He said that once we have the capacity to sympathize with others, and societies get larger and more complex, there's nothing that can prevent it from expanding to encompass the entire human species once that's set in motion. Now, if you take these three ideas of reason, science, and humanism, and say that beginning with the Enlightenment, there's been the goal of understanding the world and applying such knowledge to improve human flourishing, then one ought to enjoy progress. That is, sometimes we solve the problems that face us, we accumulate the solutions that work, and over time, human flourishing should increase. Now,
and those problems are probably best characterized by the four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, pestilence, famine. What's the fourth one? Anybody? Death, obviously, yeah.
Death.
Yeah, death.
Seems kind of...
We're looking forward to the end of this century.
Yes. Seems kind of redundant.
Yeah, it does, really.
Yeah. But really could be three horsemen.
In a sense, that's what they can address,
yes.
which were the hugest problems mankind faced for millennia.
Indeed, and all of which are concomitants of the fact that we evolved by evolution in a universe governed by entropy, and death is the ultimate kind of entropy as far as humans are concerned. Our bodies merge with the soil eventually. But so that's the hope, and then one could ask, well, the Enlightenment ideal of progress sounds good in theory. How did that Enlightenment thing work out?
And that's what you have become very well known for, is taking a lot of time, patience, and indeed graphs to explain how, in fact, that Enlightenment project has, in your opinion, worked. First with the better angels of our nature, and now with this. You really are very, very keen to show in every aspect how, across different nations and different parts of the world in different times in history, the uptick of Enlightenment has served mankind.
That's right. Now, 200 years later, we can answer the question, and the question is: there's been enormous progress, and you can graph it, and I did, and thanks in large part to the works of Max Roser, who is here, the Oxford economist, who's the proprietor of the website Our World in Data. But thanks to that and other publicly available sources of data on human flourishing, you can answer the question, have we made progress or not? Well, to take just one example, through most of human history, life expectancy at birth was around 30. Today, in the developed world, it's greater than 80, and in the world as a whole, it's 71. And very, very few people guess that it's that high. The ultimate good, the ultimate resource, life itself, has vastly increased. Partly it's because of the reduction in childhood mortality. Even in what we think of today as a affluent, healthy country, Sweden, almost a third of Swedish children died before the age of 5, a little more than 200 years ago. And then the rate of child mortality plummeted in the 19th century. And what Sweden went through, then other countries went through, including today's the countries that tragically still have the highest rates of child mortality, such as in sub-Saharan Africa, but their rates are plunging as well. And similar stories can be told for education. The world is becoming literate. I think it's on the order of 80% of the world can read or write, whereas the historical average, even in Europe, was closer to 10 to 15%. And the people who are illiterate tend to be in their 60s and 70s.
Right,
and
so they're dying.
We know which way the trend is going.
Yes.
And girls as well as boys, so the world is approaching gender equality in education and literacy. We also see progress in violent crime in any region that's beyond the reach of the law. In frontier regions, in the kind of anarchical, feudal patchwork of medieval Europe, there were rates of homicide that were 30 to 50 times higher than what we see in European countries today.
This is not war, you're talking about crime.
No, this is highwaymen and brigands and barroom fights and ladies slipping arsenic into their husband's tea and all of those kinds of personal violence. So that's plunged, including even in an outlier for a lot of these trends is, at least among Western democracies, is the United States. The United States is paradoxically, given how prominent it is among Western democracies, is something of a laggard in a lot of these dimensions of human well-being.
Or basket case, you might say.
Right. Or at least heading that way. But even in the United States, the rate of violent crime has been reduced by 50% in the last 25 years. Perhaps less obvious that war has been in decline. Not to zero, and the civil war in Syria has been the worst war in a generation. But even with the Syrian civil war, the overall rate of death in warfare is a fraction of what it was in the 80s when the Iran-Iraq war raged, when the Soviet presence in Afghanistan led to horrific fighting for a decade. There were civil wars across Africa and Latin America. With the signing of the peace agreement in Colombia in 2016, the last war in the Western Hemisphere came to an end and the last remnant of the Cold War. So 5/6 of the world's surface now is at peace, including areas like Southeast Asia, and for that matter, Europe, which were just red with blood for centuries. And an entire category of war, war between nations, particularly war between great powers, might be obsolescent. The last great power war was the Korean War in 1953. But then you can say, well, those are all kind of the measures that economists care about. What do they have to do with the quality of life and the meaning of life? Well, if you look at what you might want to consider to be indices of a meaningful life, like leisure time to spend with family and culture as opposed to the drudgery of housework. Well, thanks to the penetration of electricity, running water, washing machines, electric stoves and refrigerators, the amount of time that we spend on housework, which really means the amount of time that women spend on housework, has gone from something like 60 hours a week to 20 hours a week. The number of hours that we work has fallen by about 20 hours a week in the last century, from the days of Bob Cratchit and the Christmas Carol. And so with the combination of less time devoted to housework and less time spent at work, the amount of leisure time has increased, both for men and for women. For women, it leveled off in the 90s, and I was kind of puzzled about this. In fact, even had a bit of a dip. The reason is that women spend more time with their children today. So a working mother or a single mother today spends more hours of time with her children than a stay-at-home married mom did in the 1950s.
Right. And you're confident that that correlation is actually causative?
According to the time use studies that I plotted, that's what they found.
Because obviously people will, I mean, the Freakonomics book, for example, would say that American crime rate has gone down because abortion rates went up at exactly the time that a generation of criminals would have been born that weren't up because of Wade versus Roe. I'm sure you've read that book.
Yes. That turns out not to be, it falls into the category of too cute to be true.
Ah, right, okay.
So that turns out, I mean, it was an ingenious theory, it's not the right theory.
And anyway, obviously one of the first things that would have been put to you, because a lot of people will be hissing and saying, but. We're used to damning our own culture, to seeing it as destructive, to seeing science as ruining the world, from going from a biosphere, for a geosphere to a biosphere to a noosphere, or if we now like to call it the Anthropocene, that we have altered Mother Earth, and also all these things you've said have brought us so much leisure time and peace and prosperity. Surely they've also brought us anxiety, unhappiness, suicide, and this is the illness that is the price we pay for all the benefits that the Enlightenment may have given us. But you address this in the book as well.
Yes, so I have a chapter on happiness where I look at data on just self-reported happiness. You just ask people, how happy are you? I mean, who could be a better judge? Or imagine the worst possible life that you can imagine, and let's call that the bottom rung of a ladder, and the best possible life you could imagine, let's call it the top of the ladder, and there are 10 rungs. What rung would you say you're at? That's another way of asking a related but not identical question. When you do that, you find that in a majority of countries for which we have data over time, happiness has increased. But that only gives you a sample of countries where the data go back. They don't go back that far. On the other hand, we also find that those data tend to correlate with GDP per capita. So contrary to the idea that money can't buy happiness, I mean, it can't, exactly for every individual, but on average it kind of does. And so as the world has gotten more affluent, and all countries have gotten more affluent, there's reason to believe that world happiness has risen. As for depression, anxiety, psychopathology, there's a widespread belief that we're suffering from a new epidemic of mental illness, particularly depression. But it turns out not to survive fact-checking, that there's been more awareness of depression. There's more, as you know,
obviously, yeah.
diagnosis, and also removal of stigma so that people share their experience of suffering from depression, which has the beneficial effect of having other people coming out and noting their own and getting treatment, yeah. which can be effective. But it leads to an illusion that depression has actually increased. And the surveys that try to apply a constant yardstick over the decades suggest that it has not.
Yeah. A bit like homosexuality, because mad gay people like me have come out, it seems there are more of us, but in fact it's simply that we're noisier, perhaps.
Right.
And then there's the, Thomas Piketty and others have focused on the issue of inequality, that it seems to be going that way. And you also have things to say about that are quite sort of, wow, eye-popping to some extent.
Yeah, so inequality can be measured a lot of different ways. Yeah. This is something that I discovered as I kind of sank further and further into the inequality tar pit. And even it's very hard to get an economist to say, well, what exactly is the Gini index for the United States in the year 2015? And you can get like 5 different answers depending on how it's calculated. But a couple of things I was able to establish from this dip into the literature, and partly with the help of our world in data. One is that globally inequality is decreasing that across the planet. That whether it's measured in comparisons across countries, where each country is a unit, or as best we can estimate it in the global population, inequality is decreasing, and that's just because poor countries are getting richer so much more quickly than rich countries are getting richer. And one of the an astonishing fact of progress that we didn't discuss when I went through the list is that global poverty is decreasing. Global extreme poverty, I should say, defined by the World Bank as $1.90 per day in international dollars, kind of an arbitrary cutoff for the ability to feed yourself and your family. By some historical estimates, the rate of extreme poverty 200 years ago was about 90%. That is, about 10% of the world was not extremely poor. Now, the figures have reversed, and less than 10% of the world is extremely poor. So because of this massive increase in the fortunes of the worst off, in countries like China and Bangladesh and in many of the sub-Saharan African countries, in Latin America, global inequality has decreased. Now, unquestionably, inequality has increased within many Western wealthy countries, particularly for whatever reason, English-speaking ones, England, United States, Australia. Yeah. But I suggest that inequality is not in its economic inequality, is not in itself an evil, that it's practically impossible to avoid in any kind of economy that isn't imposed from the top down by totalitarian means. And as Walter Scheidel points out in his new book, The Great Leveling, the most effective ways, if you really want to reduce inequality, the most effective ways are violent revolution, pandemics, yeah. Mass mobilization warfare, and state collapse. Which kind of should remind us that, as he puts it, be careful of what you wish for. Yes. And I think that the moral imperative is really not inequality per se, but it's some of the possible concomitants of inequality. One of them is political inequality.
Anger, resentment, those
and the fact that the rich have too much political influence,
right, yes,
especially in the United States. But also, but really morally, what ought to attract our concern is poverty, is how much people at the bottom have, not how big is the gap between them and those at the top. And there, thanks to, especially in developing countries, thanks to market economies that have been growing and globalization, there's been a massive increase in the fortunes of the poor. In wealthier countries, the welfare state has put a floor under the poverty levels. And so even in the United States, which is famously libertarian compared to its Western peers. The United States has a pretty substantial welfare state, and as a result, poverty, when it's measured in absolute terms, not in terms of percentage of the income of the population, but in terms of what people can afford, can you afford to feed yourself and clothe yourself?
Travel to other countries.
Travel to other countries. Yeah. It's fallen from about, depending on how it's measured, from about 30% of the population in 1960 to something like 5% of the population now, when it's measured taking into account government benefits and the falling cost of many goods and services. Right. So, what I suggest is that it's really poverty that, morally, that we ought to concentrate on, and not so much inequality.
Absolutely. And so, taking your book, you lay out an argument that the Enlightenment and what followed it as a result of open thought, free reasoning, and all the advantages of science and humanism that led to industrial revolutions and yes, all kinds of new sorts of poverty, but has brought us to not exactly a shining mountaintop, but to a place which was unimaginable even 50 years ago to some extent in terms of war, starvation, and these other indices that you go by. So the book might have stopped there, but of course, really, you could subtitle it not the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress, but the enlightened society and its enemies, with a bow to Hayek. So why is it that we, as children, grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren of the Enlightenment, seem to be so disrespectful of it, so doubting of it, so cautious, so skeptical? Why don't we accept that it has given us everything we have and speak its language?
Yeah, and it's an important theme of the book is that this progress isn't some mystical upward pointing arc. It is not some historical dialectic that inevitably makes us better and better until we reach utopia. It's a result of specific efforts to solve problems and to retain the solutions that are effective. And that if there is an abandonment of that principle, then progress could go into reverse. And of course, there have been catastrophes where it has gone into reverse. And there are threats today in authoritarian populist movements that explicitly reject a lot of the themes in the institutions of the Enlightenment, such as Trumpism in the United States and some of the populist movements in Europe. As opposed to universal human flourishing, they prioritize the greatness of the nation, right. the glory of Russia or the greatness of the United States, as opposed to institutions of global cooperation, which were a theme of the Enlightenment. There's the idea that there should be zero-sum competition between nations vying for greatness, as opposed to a reliance on science and reason. There's an invoking of religion and a re-empowering of religious factions. There's often specific pushback against scientific discoveries such as vaccines.
Yes.
And
there's a story in the papers today from the WHO talking about the huge rise in measles in Europe as a result of people not vaccinated.
Talk about a self-imposed wound. I mean, we kind of are on the verge of licking that.
Yeah.
So the question is, why in an age of progress behind us are we suddenly facing these new threats? Now, partly it's because there are, I think there are features in human nature that have always made authoritarianism, tribalism appealing, that a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment are rather exotic discoveries that are enormously beneficial, but they don't come naturally to the human mind, and they've got to be kind of relearned and redefended every generation. That it's much more natural to think of the inherent goodness of my clan and to imagine that the chief directly embodies the inherent goodness and virtue of my clan, as opposed to the Enlightenment idea, most specifically articulated by the American framers, that political leadership should just be basically a bunch of committees with a committee chair that is given the responsibility of keeping people from each other's throats and for encouraging commerce, but that must live by rules that justify whatever power we apply to them, as opposed to a strong man who is...
Because, I mean, using America and the Enlightenment and the, the beautiful white columns of Washington and the, the phrasing of the Declaration of Independence and so on, a lot of Americans, less than 100 years after America became a country, were puzzled beyond belief why a country set out on such perfect Enlightenment principles and ideals should have descended into such appalling carnage. The most bloody internecine civil war still to this date in history, in its civil war. The murder massacre of species of animal, and to us more importantly, huge tribes of Native American peoples in the cruelest possible way. Gangland violence beginning in all the cities. This was a country founded in exactly Enlightenment principles, written down by Jefferson, who is one of the heroes of the Enlightenment, influenced by Paine, another hero of the Enlightenment, and by Franklin. These glorious people, but they still believed in slavery. The Enlightenment gave rise first and foremost to colonization, the enslavement and the exploitation of native peoples, of ordinary people conquered and their lands. And so there's a way of seeing the Enlightenment as having been like a virus, and you can see why people in the third world might say, well, your Enlightenment didn't enlighten us. It was either you're changing your missionary's stance from being a Catholic or a Methodist missionary to being an Enlightenment missionary, but I'm being a devil's avocado.
Yeah. No, I think it's, I do think it is certainly true that one mustn't identify the Enlightenment with the West, and particularly not with the United States, even though the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence were magnificent Enlightenment statements. But the Enlightenment clearly didn't penetrate large parts of the United States, which retained more of a kind of a manly culture of honor as a way of organizing society rather than principles justified in a set of propositions. And there's long been in the United States a divide more or less coinciding with the North and the South as to whether society should be organized by institutions justified by Enlightenment principles or by individuals defending themselves and their interests by defending their honor. Slavery, of course, is as old as civilization. Slavery is pretty much the rule rather than the exception until the 18th century. Yeah. All of the so-called great civilizations were slave-holding civilizations, including so-called democratic Athens, including Rome, including all the biblical civilizations. And that was carried over and expanded in the Europe.
A Christian might say, of course, that it was, mostly Christians, dissident Christians who first suggested, Wilberforce, people like that.
Well, it was Quakers.
And Quakers, indeed, yes. The least objectionable religions.
Exactly. But not all Christians are Quakers.
There was a Fry who was one of the friends of Fox, who was an early yes.
Oh, is that right?
My mother's side is Jewish, my father's side is Quaker. So
yes. Okay.
Yes. But yeah,
so I think it's anachronistic to connect the slave trade with
yes,
the Enlightenment.
I suppose the point I'm making is.
Yeah.
Religionists might argue that their religion, whether it's Islam or Christianity or Buddhism, is almost like a sort of serum, like Oliver Sacks's L-Dopa. You inject it in someone and they instantly have a structure and a way of looking at the world which can transform them and they can live by. But if you believe in the Enlightenment and the four pillars of it that you've adumbrated, then or laid out, then that isn't a serum. It clearly doesn't. It's not a magic bullet. It doesn't transform you or the world. It's a series of ways of working towards something. It's much tougher than a religion. It's not magical thinking.
Right, and so there is a challenge, and I end the book by wondering whether, as many cultural conservatives claim, that modern secular humanism, liberal cosmopolitanism, Enlightenment values are just too tepid to engage human animal spirits, that they won't fire people up, and that religion will never go away because it speaks to deep yearnings in the soul, and likewise with nationalism. I'm skeptical of that for a number of reasons. One of them is that societies that most carry out Enlightenment principles, the secular Western democracies like New Zealand and Denmark and Canada, they don't seem to be collapsing in spiritual enemy. They seem to be rather pleasant places to live. People seem to be doing just fine. They don't seem to be joining ISIS in great numbers to give meaning to their lives. They also are the main destination of people who vote with their feet. I mean, everyone wants to go to the great Enlightenment countries. That's where, including the people from the religiously excitable zones of the world. They don't want to stay there. They want to go to Denmark. And I raised the question of whether, do we need the kind of secular humanist equivalent? Do we need, humanist preachers thumping copies of Spinoza's Ethics on the pulpit? And,
well, you have, I won't say suffered, but you and people we know, Christopher Hitchens when he was around, and Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett, and others, have been regarded as almost evangelical, fundamentalist in your humanism, your secularism, and so on. How would you...
I don't think that's true. I mean, it's certainly not true of me, and I don't think it's true of the so-called the four horsemen of the new atheism: Hitchens, Harris, Dennett, and Dawkins. On the other hand, paradoxically, the critics of secular humanism who say that it doesn't speak to the human spirit are almost calling for exactly that. Like, well, your movement isn't going to succeed until you have your evangelical prophets of secular humanism. And do we need to have humanist congregations where people kind of roll back their eyes in ecstasy and babble in Esperanto?
But there was a man who I'm sure you knew as I did, who was a very ornery and enraging man, but a very brilliant one in his own way, Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist. I think he was the man who first proposed what he called noma, the non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, he saw that where science and religion or spirituality, they can have their own magisteria, their own realms, their own domains. I think it's ultimately very unsatisfactory because it's impossible for science not to look at everything. But what is your view of that? That whereof we should not speak, we should remain silent, because Wittgenstein, an enemy of scientism, said.
Right.
How do you speak to that?
Well, Steve Gould didn't seem to grasp that you could have a morality that did not depend on religion. He kind of gave religion the franchise for morality. He said, science can't dictate our morals, and strictly speaking, that's true, although I think it can be exaggerated. Therefore, it's religion's job. But he kind of missed out on the whole Enlightenment thing, that you can justify morality in terms of, you could do it on utilitarian grounds. What makes the largest number of people well off is moral. You could do it on deontological grounds. There's certain principles like life and choice, Kantian grounds. And you don't.
Or the social contract, I suppose, is the other.
The social contract, indeed. And you don't have to call in a deity to do it. But for all of Steve's vast erudition and knowledge, and he kind of missed the whole Enlightenment principle. I mean, that was, I think, was something of a vacuum in his
Some Stevens can be wrong. I wanted just to quote one thing which really fascinated me, because it might be a criticism leveled at you, that here, when you talk about reason, you use two archetypes, as it were, two opposites, and you miss out the middle. And I think perhaps that's an interesting idea. You say opposing reason is by definition unreasonable. That hasn't stopped a slew of irrationalists from favoring the heart over the head, the limbic system over the cortex, blinking over thinking, McCoy over Spock. And now you may say, well, talking Star Trek seems a bit silly, but actually, this is going to bring me to our dear friend Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche, in his book, The Birth of Tragedy, he pulled on two Greek gods, Dionysus and Apollo to try and explain two sides of human nature, what Freud might have called the id and the superego or the ego. It's hard to tell which it is. In other words, that Greek tragedy, as he saw it, was playing off on the tensions between the tribal, bloodlust, frenzied side of our animal selves and this rational, Apollonian, harmonious side of ourselves. And oddly enough, and Gene Roddenberry was a genius, if you look at Star Trek, there is McCoy, who's always going, "You green-blooded monster, Spock." And Spock is saying, "Fascinating." That one of them is logic, you know, how can your logic account for that, Spock? And McCoy, the doctor, is physical and primal and emotional. But the whole point is in the middle is Kirk. Who tries to be both. They will go to a planet which is all id, and Kirk will try and explain that there is such a thing as reason and order, or they will go to one that is all order, and he will try and say, "Well, where's your humanity?" and you really do have it in for Nietzsche, because you see the neo-Nazi, or not neo, crypto or proto-Nazi side of Nietzsche, the man and Superman, which some people regard as a fiction that he was putting forward, not the, although he did die mad, so it's very hard to know. But I just wanted to see, you know, the romantic movement constantly crashed waves against the wall of the Enlightenment, and it's still doing it today, that romantic sense of the individual, the maverick, aside from the tribe, and it can become insane in Nazism or Ayn Randism, but it also is something we can instinctively feel for, can't we?
Yes, and I think it can lead to some great art, great plot lines, but it isn't much of a way to organize politics in society. and I might add, quoting from a great figure, "You would not enjoy Nietzsche, sir. He's fundamentally unsound."
Jeeves! Yes,
Jeeves, exactly.
Right.
Yes,
absolutely right. Jeeves like Spinoza.
Jeeves like Spinoza, and to bring it
good Jewish philosopher.
Exactly, and to bring it home. Captain Kirk was played by a fellow Montreal Jew, William Shatner.
Of course.
Who was a lanceman, part of my tribe. So.
Now, it's good you mentioned Canada, because you are, of course, Canadian, and I suppose there is, you know, the archetype public intellectual Canadian was the great Marshall McLuhan, a man of extraordinary influence to this day, whose prophecies and sense of how society would respond to what he famously called the global village, and the anxieties that the written word, the first information age movement would bring about. And you read him today, and it's still pretty astonishing. He's quite difficult to read sometimes, but an extraordinary man, and you have fitted this role as a Canadian public intellectual too. And the third man who's recently come rather into the news is Jordan Peterson. And while most people would have thought, well, there's Steven Pinker, he's a liberal humanist, and there's this Jordan Peterson, is he perhaps a bit right-wing? Does he sort of dog whistle a little for the alt-right? There was a famous, I'm sure you saw his interview here on Channel 4 television, did you, with Kathy Newman? Yes. Now, for those who don't know, he's also, like you, a psychologist, essentially, isn't he?
Yep.
And he's written some very successful books. But you both, I think, meet on your detestation of what you might call, what he would certainly call cultural Marxism in the campus. And you yourself have suffered from some extraordinary blowback on that. And I'd love to just to share the story of what happened to you recently when you spoke about, very sensibly, about the nature of deplatforming and all the things we are aware of in American, particularly American academic institutions.
Yes, I participated in an event at Harvard organized by the Open Campus Initiative, which is a student organization dedicated to free speech, belying the common accusation that the entire millennial generation doesn't get the concept of free speech, and they're just social justice warriors and snowflakes. And so these are our Harvard students who are quite adamant in defending what they call an open campus, in conjunction with Spiked magazine here in the UK. And the panel that they convened was, did political correctness help elect Trump? And they had it on close to the anniversary of the Trumpocalypse,
yes.
November 8th. And they had me, they had Wendy Kamner, a well-known Boston area civil libertarian, and Brendan Jones. And a number of us argued that obviously the Trump victory had a number of causes, but one of them was that there's certainly a sector of the population that voted for Trump despite his flagrant unsuitability for the job, as a reaction to the stifling of opinions in forums such as college campuses. And in particular, this is true of I pointed out, of the alt-right. And by alt-right, I don't mean the skinheads with the tiki torches, the neo-Nazis, but rather the highly educated, often tech-savvy, young, almost exclusively men, who find themselves, come across just empirical facts that are undiscussable in college campuses, such as the fact that different ethnic groups don't have the same crime rates, that men and women aren't indistinguishable, that capitalist economies are more efficient and more humane than communist ones. And they find themselves immediately stomped on like a ton of bricks if any of these facts are so much as mentioned. They withdraw, assuming that there are certain truths that the mainstream establishment can't handle. Then they spin them in the most toxic possible directions because they've never had a chance for these opinions to be put into context, such as the fact that there are differences between the sexes doesn't mean that sexism is justified.
No, because no kind of corollary.
Because fairness and sameness are not the same thing, to quote Helena Cronin. That all abilities that show differences in the means show enormous overlap in the distributions, such as that there are a number of traits in which men on average are better than women, but many traits for which women are better than men. Likewise, the fact that there are differences in the crime rates now for African Americans and whites is just part of a general pattern that there are always differences in.
But those secondary explanations, those glosses on the statistics aren't got to because...
They've never got to.
Because everything is closed down. You're not allowed to say there is more crime here than there. You're not allowed to say there are differences between genders here.
Exactly, so you don't come across
so
other equally relevant facts.
Explain them.
It used to be that Irish Americans had higher crime rates than Protestant Americans. That was a gap that disappeared, and so the black-white gap could disappear as well. But if you only get the taboo fact and not the context and the arguments that prevent you from taking that fact and drawing harmful consequences, then you will draw the harmful consequences.
And you said as much at this meeting.
And the result is the alt-right. And the reason that I know this has happened, this is not speculation, is that I've gotten emails from disturbingly former students of mine at Harvard, so these are no dummies, from young men in tech, Jamie Damore being an example, not that I've ever contacted him, but he's almost a prototype. And they are because of the suppression of speech and debate, the alt-right becomes their congenial landing site, and
and they feed each other on what else is being kept in the dark by the libtards, the lefties, and so on.
Indeed, and they can say that there are certain things that are, that the academic mainstream can't handle the truth, and there's a sense in which they're right. But then those ideologies can kind of fester without the proper immune response, and the result is that you have intelligent people voting for a bizarrely dangerous and unqualified candidate for president. Anyway, so those remarks were then doctored so that only the part that says that in which I noted that there are intelligent and educated members of the alt-right, which I know for a fact because some of them were Harvard students.
And Milo Yiannopoulos went to Cambridge.
Another example. And that was then doctored and presented both on left-wing sites and right-wing sites as a kind of support for the alt-right, whereas it was actually a tactic for starving the alt-right.
So so sensitive, so hypersensitive, raw are the culture wars that you would suddenly being accused by the left of being right-wing because the right wing had edited everything you had said and doctored it.
Fortunately, both the Guardian and the New York Times came to my defense. There was actually an article in an op-ed in the New York Times entitled "How Social Media Are Making Us Stupid," and used that as the way that I was taken out of context as a prime example.
Am I being very stupid in saying that, in the same way at the very beginning you said what language taught you about what's programmed, what's coded within us, how language is a faculty, allowed you to put that idea out into other human faculties? And actually, isn't that what formalism and structuralism that then became the postmodernism that you so decry and deplore, isn't that what they did? They said, let's look at language as a kind of structure, and let's use what we know about language, including phonology and phonemes, and apply them to social activity, hence the Eames suffix becoming such a common thing now that we find, mythemes and, of course, memes that Richard Dawkins coined, that they did the same thing. They took the intellectual idea of study of language and said, society is a kind of language. It has the same sorts of rules. It's the same idea. But this is something, of course, you fundamentally disagree with, is postmodern thinking on society. And I wondered if you could just elaborate on that and why you think it's so deleterious to our culture.
No, you're right. There was a kind of circuitous route by which the structural linguistics of Roman Jakobson and Trubetskoy, Saussure, then got ported over into anthropology by Claude Lévi-Strauss. And then
to Marxism with Althusser and so on.
Indeed, and then taken into the I think rather eccentric position that thought consists of nothing but arbitrary oppositions in self-contained symbol systems, although the structuralism then became post-structuralism, which in fairly abstruse and ways abandoned the exact propositions of structural linguistics and anthropology. But still, it retained the idea, which then got carried over into Derrida's deconstructionism, that all statements are inherently paradoxical or circular because they're just symbols that refer to other symbols that refer to other symbols in a kind of closed circle. But what it left out of the entire discussion in the entire course of modern linguistics is there's not just syntax and phonology, but there's also semantics. That is, language refers to stuff. That got left out. It refers to stuff both because it's connected to the world via perception. We actually, our linguistic symbols like dog and table aren't just defined in like a dictionary definition in terms of an animal and mammal, but they also, they're little pictures in the dictionary, and our perceptual system connects us to reality. And they're also connected to a web of inference, of logical conclusions that we can draw that make meaning not completely arbitrary, but enmeshed with our scientific understanding of the world. The fact that a dog is a mammal and a mammal is a living thing. These aren't just arbitrary symbols, but they actually have content.
And that widens out socially into, I suppose, the argument between relativism and, what is the opposite of relativism?
Realism.
You'd say realism, because they would say absolutism.
That's right. No, realism, scientific realism, which is the philosophy of science, that scientific propositions are actually about something, they're actually about the world, and they can be true or false.
So, because just to sort of finish off, in a way, one of the things we've started to learn, those of us who are curious about neuroscience, is that since you started writing, even one of the things that's become even more apparent to David Eagleton and Kahneman and Tversky and all these others have shown us how contingent our knowledge is. They've taken ideas, obvious ideas we grew up with, like illusions, pictures, are they two faces or a candlestick, or is this a straight line? We realize how our brain is interpreting reality in a very non-realist way. And so we also now realize that reason itself is not stable or reliable. It seems very fragile. You write brilliantly about some of the experiments that show intelligent, liberal people who believe in evolution don't actually understand it. And if they're asked a few questions, which is true, they will often get it wrong on the basis of their misunderstanding of basic Darwinism. And so you kind of think, well, maybe there's something in this, not necessarily Derrida or Lacan, Foucault, or any particular of these idiotic Frenchmen whose greatest, well, if only they could write. Roland Barthes could write, so you could believe in him, because he wrote beautifully, but they write so badly, they can't be true. Sort of, must be true. But nonetheless, this idea that our reality is not what it seems, and that somehow you're being scientistist, you're being, you're guilty of scientism, you're too cold and real, and actually life is more fragile and ethereal and strange and difficult.
Yes.
Well, how do you answer?
Well, life is fragile and strange, and will always be mystifying. But when we develop policies, when we develop institutions, especially ones that wield power, we must, to the best of our ability, root them in reason and scientific reality, which is never going to be absolute, but is the only reality that we can approach. And crucially, you invoked people in my own profession, like Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who of course have shown the limitations of human reason, that we're vulnerable to illusions and
biases. Biases, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
And I note that there's a false conclusion that some people draw, that this is a refutation of the Enlightenment belief that we're completely rational. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers were adamant that we're not rational. They were some of the best students of human quirks and follies, and people like Adam Smith and David Hume and Spinoza just went to town with our emotional passions, the fallacies that we're vulnerable to. But what I take to be the point of the Enlightenment emphasis on reason is not that every person is inherently rational, but that we do have some capacity for rationality, and we must if we're even discussing the question, because the only way you could say humans are irrational is if you had some benchmark of rationality against which to compare them. Otherwise, the question itself would be meaningless.
So yes, compared to ladybirds or compared to bears.
Well, also that when people make some fallacy, like taking a stereotype, the prototypical example would be Linda, the articulate woman committed to social justice and activism. Is she more likely to be a bank teller or a feminist bank teller? People say she's more likely to be a feminist bank teller. Now that, of course, violates the laws of probability, because the probability of a conjunction always has to be less than or equal to the probability of one of the conjuncts. So since all feminist bank tellers are bank tellers, it's actually impossible for it to be more likely that she's a feminist bank teller than a bank teller, because they're all...
Now this, of course...
Now, the fact that I can explain it, and that they explained it, that they called it a fallacy, they called it a fallacy like compared to what? Compared to laws of logic and probability, which they could understand, so at least they're rational. Anyone who reads them can understand them, so the people who read it are rational. So it's a mistake to say that we're incapable of rationality, even if it doesn't come easy to us.
But does it mean that we have to submit, because I'm sure I'm not alone in this room of finding your splendid, almost Bertrand Russell-like use of logic there. Oh God, that's what happens when I read philosophy. I have to turn back 2 pages. Yeah, I've got it, turn the page. I've lost it again, go back. Oh, damn, what was the proposition? What was the postulate? What was the syllogism? What was the, even in your, I have to say, your wonderful graphs that you and your friend here produced, suddenly a word like percentile or quantile will come up, and if it ends in "ile", I don't know what it means. What's the difference in a percentage and a percentile? And I'm obviously, and so I have to basically say, Stephen knows what he's talking about. I assume he's right, and in a sense, some people would argue that that's no different to the hermeneutic exegesis that the priest and the the hierophant is explaining to their obedient flock. Yes. Only I can interpret these facts, and the moment you start to use words that are from science and from logic, most of us go, I sort of followed it, and then you said conjunct.
Oh, yes, okay.
Then I lost it, you know?
Yes. So yes, so to the extent in which it feels like that, then there's been a failure, that I failed. Because it has to be.
Richard Feynman would have claimed that he could explain it to an 11-year-old if it was
well,
physics.
that is the aspiration,
Yeah.
and indeed it would be completely contrary to the spirit of science for scientists to be considered to be some priesthood.
Yeah.
It's got to be that you might have to put a little work into it, but you can reconstruct the logic for yourself.
Yeah.
It must be. And so the overall principle is that we obviously are capable of reason, just to have this discussion in the first place, and that there are norms and institutions that can foster reason collectively, if not necessarily individually in each one of us. So norms such as free speech, that if you say something, someone else is allowed to criticize it, so you can't rest on authority, such as empirical testing, such as peer review, such as double-blind studies, all of the, in the court of law, standards of evidence, standards of justice, fact-finding commissions, journalistic ethics, all of the principles that make us collectively smarter than any of us individually would be. And that's what we have to rely upon, not any assumption that any individual in isolation is particularly wise or rational.
I mean, in the end, I'm always prepared to believe a mathematician or a scientist because they can say, at 11 on the 23rd of June in the year 2031, there will be an eclipse here. And if you want, they'll show you they're working. Exactly. And I've never heard a priest or a spiritualist ever predict anything like that.
Yeah,
or I switch the switch and the light goes on. It almost seems magic to me, but I know that if I were to study long enough, I would find the chain of reasoning, the chain of discovery that has led to that light turning on, whereas everything else is either magical thinking or mystery or you know, a sort of hidden, you have to believe without being shown the working.
Yeah, indeed. And there is, in terms of the arcane technical vocabulary being inaccessible to you know, a wide lay readership, that itself changes over time, because there has been a steady trickle down of technical concepts from scientists and scholars and policy wonks into conventional understanding. And that may even be one of the drivers of perhaps the most bizarre index of progress, or example of progress, the Flynn effect, the rise in IQ scores over the decades by about 3 IQ points per decade, resulting in a cumulative improvement of about 30 IQ points over the century. And one of the explanations is how that could happen, given that it's not like we've...
They read your books.
Well, they've read... People have read books and had access to some of what started out as arcane ideas that then kind of proliferate through the population. And so ideas that we even take for granted now started out as pretty exotic concepts. So just an example, you know, nowadays if someone said, well, I ate some dandelions and my headache doesn't bother me anymore. And you say, oh, that's probably just a placebo effect. Yeah. It's just a placebo. Now, the placebo effect was at one point a fairly exotic concept in epidemiology, but now most educated people kind of know what it is, or correlation versus causation.
Yeah.
Win-win situation. Trade-off, market.
Zero-sum game.
Zero-sum game.
Yeah. These are things we're familiar with, which are really quite complex ideas, might have been considered 100 years ago, needing a lot of explanation.
Zero-sum came out of game theory,
yes.
A fairly arcane branch of mathematics.
Yeah.
So what can happen is, with education, and also not just education in school, but in proliferation of ideas through, you know, the BBC and magazines, yes. and websites, yeah. and so on, that the kind of baseline understanding can be smarter, it can become smarter, and so more sophisticated concepts become part of the conventional wisdom.
Well, I have to say, as you saw, I got given a note here, and we've talked, so I could go on forever. I just love talking to you. I love the way you just open things up. And if enlightenment has that word light in it, and you do show us, you know, you show light on all kinds of areas of our thinking and our behavior. And I do want to thank you and want to tell everybody here that Stephen will be spending 20 minutes signing copies of the book. But I know you'll want to join me in thanking him for his fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.